Yes.
Yes, Shweta ma'am, please start.
Men are mortal, so are ideas. An idea needs propagation as much as a plant needs watering. Otherwise, both will wither and die. When I was searching for an appropriate quote to open today's proceeding, I came across these lines by the great Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, and I realized that no other person and no other quote is as adequate as this one, because we, the Department of English, know this better than anyone else, that thoughts and ideas that are sowed in the soil of literature, when watered by reception and perception of readers, grow into immortal trees that bear fruit for generations to come. Good morning to all present here. I, Dr. Shweta Kapoor from the Department of English, Symbiosis College of Arts and Commerce, welcome you all to this national webinar entitled Nation, Identity and Literature, Reflection on 75 Years of Independence. Today's webinar is divided into two sessions, each followed by a question and answer round. There will be a lunch break of 45 minutes after the completion of session 1. In this one-day event, we will be listening to four eminent professors who are also renowned speakers, celebrated authors, and inquisitive scholars from four different parts of India. And I'm quite sure each one of you will take something with you by the end of the day. So without further ado, I would like to invite the head of our department, Professor Aarti Vani, herself a dexterous scholar and author, to please take over to welcome all the attendees and throw some light on the idea behind today's webinar. Ma'am, please. Aarti ma'am?
She's frozen.
All right. Thank you, Shweta. A very good morning to all, and especially to our guest speakers, Professor Kamlakar Bhatt, Dr. Medha Bhattacharya, and of course, our very own principal, Dr. Rishikesh Soman, colleagues, fellow teachers, and most of our students and participants who have joined, I'm told, from across the country. On behalf of the Department of English, I welcome you to this webinar, which promises to engage us in an exciting exchange of ideas and opinions on the question of nation and identity in the context of literature. Before we dive into this very interesting conversation, I would like to share with you the purpose of the webinar, the idea behind it. Most of us are aware that we are now in the 75th year of our independence. An independence and freedom from foreign rule that was hard won with immense courage and sacrifice on the part of our freedom fighters, and which is therefore all the more precious to us. When we reflect upon the fact that we are now a 75-year-old democracy, there's rightfully a sense of achievement and a quiet pride. We must pause and let that sink. But even as we do so, we begin to realize that in a couple of decades, we will turn 100. Just as at some point, not long ago, we must have been just 2 or 10. The point I'm trying to make is that nation, or any nation, is like an organic creature. It is born, it grows, it changes, it transforms. In that sense, a nation can never be a finished product. It is always a work in progress. Benedict Anderson, one of the most important theoreticians of nationalism, said that a nation is an imagined community. What he meant was that for a people to identify themselves with a nation is a sophisticated act of imagination. It was always more natural and easier for anyone to identify herself with her local, immediate context. I live in Pune, therefore I'm a Puneite. I speak Marathi, therefore I'm a Maharashtrian. I practice a certain religion, therefore I'm a Hindu or a Muslim. But when a nation is forged, it calls upon the people to identify with a more abstract, a higher entity. It is a leap of faith. One may almost say that it is a flight of imagination to go from being a Konkani or a Jain to being an Indian. It was the same a couple of centuries ago for a whole continent of Christians who identified themselves with different nationalities as French or Germans or Italians. According to Anderson, the birth of various nationalism was coterminous with print capitalism. In other words, certain economic formations along with certain technological advance facilitates the making of nations. The spread of literacy, standardization of languages, the spread of media, specifically print media, newspapers, school textbooks, literature, etc., help in bringing a diverse population together under the umbrella of a nation. At the same time, to reiterate the earlier point, the nation continues to be a work in progress. Needs to be figured and refigured, imagined and reimagined. And one of the ways in which that happens is through literature. Fiction, drama, poetry are sites where the contours of the nation can be redrawn, questioned, contested. Since the best of literature is able to speak truth to power, it is also an arena where those who have been left out on the margins of the nation can find a voice and call it out. It is for this reason that in this 75th year of our democracy, we have organized a webinar that will probe the questions of nation and identity, but through the lens of literature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Vani. Now I would like to invite our principal, Dr. Rishikesh Soman, scholar, innovator, great administrator, and the vision behind SCAC to please say a few words.
Thank you, Shweta. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the webinar organized by Department of English on the topic Nation, Identity and Literature, Reflections on India's 75 Years of Independence. When Dr. Vani was saying, one idea came to my mind, or rather, it struck me that modern India may be considered as 75 years old, but somehow, irrespective of our overall geography, India as a country or India as a nation has been there in the minds of people, I think, for thousands and thousands of years. I mean, I always wonder this particular concept, that how we are so diverse, we have got so much of a language and customs and rituals and all this kind of diversity, and yet there was one common thread uh, for so many thousand years, in fact, and that was being understood by everybody. Uh, I don't know how, and that always puzzles me. So India as a nation, or as what very rightly said by Dr. Vani, that it's imagination, or it's a kind of very creative imagination that associating something with nationality or nation. I always wonder that is it a kind of a miracle that in spite of such kind of thing, in spite of lack of communication or whatever it is, it has always been described as a nation. It has always been described as one entity as such. And of course, now we are talking about the modern India that was created in 1947. And I am sure that the literature that we are going to discuss today, uh, that is naturally going to talk about the entire reflection of these 75 years in the in the from the perspective of various authors. So I believe it is going to be very interesting discussions and deliberations, and the speakers are also very eminent, and they will be throwing light, and as they are coming from different genres and different parts of the country, I think they will be having varied views on this, and I believe the students and the colleagues of mine who will be who have already joined this webinar will be immensely benefited. So I once again welcome all the speakers. I congratulate the Department of English, Dr. Vani, Dr. Adagale, Dr. Shweta, Dr. Suvarna, for organizing this particular webinar. And it's a very interesting subject. I mean, if I would have got time, I would have really attended the entire thing. But then it is a very interesting seminar, and I'm sure we all there could be really very animated discussions and question answer sessions that I predict, and that is going to be really interesting for everybody, and the learning process would be very vibrant today. That what I feel. So I once again welcome all of you, and I wish all the success to the webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soman. Now I would request Ms. Devika Dhumal, Assistant Professor, Department of English, to introduce the speakers for the first session. Devika, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shweta. Okay. So, a Fulbright scholar in residence at the Bridgewater State University, USA. Dr. Medha Bhattacharya is an assistant professor in the Department of Basic Sciences and Humanities in the Bengal Institute of Technology, Kolkata, and is currently teaching at the Department of Communication Studies and English in the United States. Dr. Bhattacharya has been teaching since the past 18 years. She has delivered talks in renowned universities, both national and international, like the Harvard University, Princeton, and the University of Pennsylvania. She was awarded her PhD at the Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda University, and her areas of research entail Rabindranath Tagore studies, Canadian studies, translation studies, religion, creative writing, ESL, and South Asia and diaspora studies. Her book, Rabindranath Tagore's Shantiniketan Essays, Religion, Spirituality and Philosophy, was published by Routledge in 2020. To add on to her achievements, Dr. Bhattacharya was the academic advisor for the entry on Rabindranath Tagore in the 20th Century Literary Criticism series by Gail Sengage. She was also the recipient of the prestigious award of the Certificate of Appreciation from Maulana Abul Kalam Azad University of Technology for her outstanding contribution to teaching, learning, and research. We are delighted to have you with us here today, ma'am. Without further ado, I would like to call upon Dr. Bhattacharya to deliver her talk and enrich us with her insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. Are my slides visible?
Yes,
Can you?
Yes, ma'am, there.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. I'm going to present a topic which is titled Rabindranath Tagore's Gora and Ghore Baire, The Home and the World, a Contemporary Interpretation. So everyone has rightly pointed out that we are definitely in our 75th year, and we are pretty young as a country. But we have a heritage of thousands of years, and that heritage, that philosophy has groomed us in a different way, and Tagore is no exception. So with this, I would start with a few questions where we can start asking ourselves where we stand with respect to today. That is the contemporary interpretation. When countries are steeped neck deep in nationalism in the contemporary era, does it make the concept of the nation look bad? Does it seem as if restricting oneself to a particular national identity is a disturbing notion? In the course of this talk, I will try and render answers to these questions. I think sorry. Various thinkers had similar ideas of the construct of nationalism. Ernst Gellner, in his book titled Nationalism, opines that, I quote, nationalism does indeed see itself as a universal, perennial, and inherently self-evidently valid principle. It is, on this view, simply natural that people should wish to live with their own kind, that they should be averse to living with people of a different culture, and above all, that they should resent being governed by them. This is perhaps the commonest of theories of nationalism. In one sense, it is barely a theory because it treats the principle as something inherent in human nature, or the very principles of social organization, so obvious as not really to require any explanation. It is, on this view, only the absence or violation of the principle which needs to be explained, end quote. He further mentions that this vision of nationalism itself is something which is difficult to comprehend because he mentions that whoever gave this definition to nationalism must have been the enemy of the concept of nationalism. I quote from him again: humanitarian internationalists who deplored the particularism, exclusiveness, intolerance, narrowness, and brutality of nationalism nevertheless often concede with great regret that these traits are deeply and perhaps universally rooted in the human heart or mind, end quote. So this definition is trying to say that when a person does something and thinks that he or she has to live inherently with people of his or her kind and not get associated with other people, that is a dangerous thing. And that is where we should be careful about. So this is his definition of nationalism and how we should be a bit wary of such a concept, which is defined as nationalism. Like Dr. Vani has already mentioned in her address, that Benedict Anderson defines the nation as an imagined community. So it's almost like a virtual reality where we imagine that we are all together. We are from different parts of India and we are all together. And I'm an Indian sitting here in the US. There is another Indian sitting at some other place in India or abroad. So what is it that unites us and makes us Indian? Is it the geographical concept of India, or is it something else? So this is something we should think about. And Homi Bhabha describes it as nations lose their origins in the midst of time and only fully realize their horizons in the mind's eye. So here too, he's talking about a situation where it is sort of imaginary. It's not real in a sense that you have, for example, I'm delivering a presentation, my video is on, or you can see my slides. So this is something that you can actually see, but the concept of a nation, how can you see it? So how do you define it in a way? Is it the boundary? Or is it a spiritual concept? Is it some kind of emotional concept? Or what is it actually? It's very difficult to define this. Tagore's concept of universalism, he mentions, I quote, "What is needed is eagerness of heart for a fruitful communication between different cultures. Anything that prevents this is barbarism," end quote. So he believes that there should not be any constriction. I'm dealing with the definitions and what people have said about nationalism, universalism, internationalism, because that would give us an idea of how to approach the text Ghore Baire and Gora. And then I would like to go into the Vedantic format. I'll just come to the, after finishing with the definitions, I'll just come to the approach that I would take. So this is what Tagore talks about in his Universalism. In his book, Nationalism, one of the definitions he offers to nationalism is, there is only one history, the history of man. All national histories are merely chapters in the larger one. And we are content in India to suffer for such a great cause. Each individual has his self-love. Therefore, his brute instinct leads him to fight with others in the sole pursuit of his self-interest. But man has also his higher instincts of sympathy and mutual help. The people who are lacking in this higher moral power, who therefore cannot combine in fellowship with one another, must perish or live in a state of degradation. Only those peoples have survived and achieved civilization who have this spirit of cooperation strong in them. So we find that from the beginning of history, men had to choose between fighting with one another and combining, between serving their own interest or the common interest of all. So in this paper, I argue that finite and infinite identities are intricately linked, picking from this definition of Tagore. So what does that mean? One cannot exist without the other. Nationalism, the finite, cannot function on its own without internationalism, the infinite dimension of it. Sorry. Tagore aimed to go beyond the finiteness of Hindu nationalism and Indian patriotism. And in the introduction to Ghore Baire's translation, the translator Nivedita Sen in her introduction mentions, I quote from it, "The novel refers to events taking place in the wake of Curzon's attempted division of Bengal in 1905, when the extremists had started resorting to coercive methods targeting the masses for quick results. Politically, the novel is a critique of Swadeshi endeavors that had such short-sighted objectives." End quote. And here we find that, I'm sorry, it keeps changing. Tagore is more interested in oneness of people rather than the alienation of people. So when it comes to the novel, for example, Gora, we find that it is an important fact that Gora initially was for Hinduism, Hindu patriotism, and he believed that anything apart from the proper Hindu rituals and the proper Hindu way of life is like going against the national ideals. So he was in touch with Paresh Babu and his family, but in spite of everything, he kept himself aloof from all that. And then he discovered one fine day that he's not even an Indian by birth. He is an Irishman adopted by a Brahmin family. And he was brought up in a particular way. And then that opens his eyes. And he tries to see nationalism in a different light, in an all-engulfing humanism. And he follows the liberal ideas of the Brahma Samaj and leaves the typical Hindu rituals aside. And he follows love basically, and love is present in Gora in different ways because in Tagore literature, love and joy are synonymous. Vishwanath Naravani in his thesis mentions that in Tagore literature, love and joy almost have the similar meaning. And when I come to the later part of the presentation, I'll be explaining more on that. Love is a dominant theme in the whole of Tagore literature because it's there in all the texts. Majority of the texts have love as the core. In Gora, we see Anandamoyi's love for her adopted son. So that is the name of Gora's foster mother. And Gora says about his mother after the revelation that he is an Irishman's son. He says, I quote, "Mother, you are my mother, the mother whom I have been wandering about in search of all the time sitting in my room at home. You have no caste, you make no distinctions, and have no hatred. You are the only image of our welfare." End quote. This reveals how the finite love of a mother for her son reaches the infinite dimension because a mother does not discriminate against her children on the grounds of sex, caste, religion. Shishir Kumar Ghosh in the Makers of Indian Literature mentions regarding the character of Gora, and he says, I quote, "He is not immune from change and love, and it is Chuchorita rather than Paresh Babu that helps to bring about the change in Gora," end quote. So it is again love of Chuchorita which motivates Gora to see things in a different light because he was very resistant to change initially, and he thought, he was convinced of what he was doing, and he knew that that was the right path. And initially his nationalism, Binoy points out, Binoy is his closest friend, and he points out that, well, your nationalism is devoid of one part of the Indian nationality. And what is that part? And that part is the part of the women. You have not included them in your vision of nationalism. And he admits that that was the case. So this change is evident when Gora discovers his Irish identity and is freed from the bondage of caste and creed, because he was very obsessed with caste initially. And he asks Chuchorita, his love, to take his hand and lead him to his, and to lead Gora to Chuchorita's guru, that is Paresh Babu. And so it is love which gives him the joy and to proceed towards the infinite. So from the finite love between two people, here in this case man and woman, evolves a greater love for something more divine, because he is going towards the religious path. He is going towards the liberal religious path, which is Brahmoism, the Brahmo Samaj culture. Another instance of finite love leading to infinite can be seen in Tagore's novel, The Home and the World. Nikhil's love for his wife, Bimola, makes him feel that he should not tie his companion or put fetters around his companion and let Bimola's ideas about life, nationalism, about the society evolve on its own, and he allows her to come to the outer place, outer territory of their home, the conservative zamindari household. And this, by doing this, he shows Bimola that she is able to embrace what the outside world has to offer. But again, there is she is compelled by the tradition as well. So there is a tension between modernity and the traditional points of view. But she meets Sandeep and a kind of relationship develops, whether it is love or something else, perhaps. But again, it is Sandeep also has developed a kind of relationship with Bimala, and that there is maybe a percentage of love. But Sandeep has a lot of self-love, and he admits that he does. And in spite of being a Swadeshi, his tastes and desires and his ways of living are much beyond the meager way in which a Swadeshi person is supposed to live. And this is what Tagore criticizes in the novel, that how the Swadeshis were not very sensitive towards the need of people who actually needed them. For example, the banishing of the foreign goods. In fact, the foreign goods were cheaper, and the poor Indians at that point in time could not afford the local goods produced by the Indians because they were very expensive. And Shondeep was not very receptive to this. Whereas Nikhil, the Zamidar, he was more receptive to this concept, and he was not very happy with what Shondeep was doing, because he saw that in his under his rule, there were a lot of Muslims who were very much deprived, and they could not afford to get Indian goods made by the Indian companies. And so he protested regarding this. But again, it shows Shondeep he believes in something himself, and he wants to be divisive, and he does not care about the needs of his fellow Indians. And Tagore was very much against this militant nationalism. He was more for all-engulfing, all-accepting universalism, humanism. And we go back to where, after having that relationship with Shondeep, Bimala understands what's going on, and then she returns to her husband. I mean, she returns to accept her husband. And we find that her husband is not judgmental about whatever she has done, because out of love, he has allowed her to go and explore the world. And it is only rewarding that she has returned from the world to again get back to him and appreciate him. I'll quickly go to another quotation by Tagore so as to make this more clear. I quote, "I have no hesitation in saying that those who are gifted with the moral power of love and vision of spiritual unity, who have the least feeling of enmity against aliens and the sympathetic insight to place themselves in the position of others, will be the fittest to take their permanent place in the age that is lying before us, and those who are constantly developing their instinct of fight and intolerance of aliens will be eliminated," end quote. And there is another quote, which is sympathetic insight to place themselves in the position of others. This particular quote shows how empathetic Tagore was during his time, because he could feel what his fellow Indians were going through even during that Swadeshi period, when he actually started seeing how rough the whole period was, or how things were for his fellow Indians who were not that privileged. He really took a back seat regarding such militant nationalism. And we find how, through this quotation, of course, we find how it is more relevant even now, wherever we are, because most of the times we like to other people, quote within quotes, other. And we sometimes don't see things from their point of view. But even 100 years before this, Tagore is actually pointing out how it is important to do that because it's for your own sustenance. So I'll quickly go to the finite and infinite. How did Tagore have such vision of life at a very young age, at about 11 years of age? Of course, he used to preach in the Brahmo Samaj, and he read the Upanishads and all the scriptural texts because he believed that you should read them not through interpretation, but from the original. So obviously he has done that. And when he was 11, a page from his father's book, obviously this is the Isha Upanishad we're talking about, through the gust of a wind, fell on the floor and caught this sloka, caught his attention. It is Isha Vashamidam Sarvam Yat Kincha Jagattam Jagat Tena Taktena Bhunjita Magridha Kasya Siddhanam. And it means in this world, everything is perishable, yet pervaded by the Supreme Being. So protect the Atman by renunciation. Never have greed for anyone's wealth. So this is, I think, what prompted him to think of universalism not being constricted by smaller things in life. So he compares nationalism to a finite thing and universalism to an infinite dimension. We find the themes of love, finite, infinite, and harmonious coexistence of opposites in both these texts that we're talking about. And I'm going to use my translation of the Shantiniketan essays, which I have translated and published, of course, I'm going to use that tool to interpret the two novels under question today. So love, finite, infinite, harmonious coexistence of the opposites. In the beginning, Dr. Soman was talking about the fact that how our tradition goes back for a long time, and how we Indians, being so diverse, managed to stay under this, national flag called national identity called India. So one of the reasons would be love. The concept of Hladini Shakti, I'm just going to be very brief with it. Hladini Shakti, corresponding to Ananda, is the energy by which he, the supreme reality, usually it's referred to as Krishna, because this is a Vaishnava philosophy. And this particular concept has been seen in Tagore's Shantiniketan essay. And it is prevalent in other pieces of literature that he has written as well. So that's why I'm using this for the two texts under question here, which he, the supreme reality, enjoys his own innate bliss and makes others enjoy the same. So it's like enjoying creation as well as making others enjoy. So it's the concept of Leela in act over here. So there is a lot of joy in creation, and God is also making you happy through those creations. We can talk about this more maybe in the question answer round. Another Vaishnava philosophy, or the way, this is not exactly Vaishnava, but it's a different Vedantic interpretation, and it's called Achinta Bheda Bhed. Why the finite and the infinite go together, or why there is a harmonious understanding between two opposites, it would be explained through the concept of Achinta Bheda Bhed. And Achinta means inconceivable, illogical. There's something which goes beyond logic. And Bheda Bhed means difference. Bheda means difference. Abheda means non-difference. And so it means difference in non-difference. So there is no logic why there is this concept of difference in non-difference. So there is no difference apparently, but then there is again a difference. So Finite and infinite, they look different, but again, they're similar. And the concept of Achinta Bheda Bhed aims to explain that. So I'll just render a few quotations to make this clear, this concept clear from the Shantiniketan essays. In the essay, The Whole, I quote from there, when man attempts to see the whole all at once, he sees it hazily. Hence, he first sees it in parts, and then he unites the parts into the whole. For this reason, if he sees only the parts and completely denies the whole, then he has to be seriously answerable for that. Again, if he only aims at the whole and completely ignores the parts, then that emptiness becomes totally futile for him. End quote. So when we put the concept of nationalism and internationalism or universalism, we see that when we just look at nationalism, it's a very constricted, perhaps, idea where I say, I'm not going to, like when we see one of the definitions there, that it's very constricted. You are motivated from self-love. You are doing things just for your own benefit, or you think this is a particular thing. So I'm an Indian. I'm not going to talk much with other people, the aliens, quote unquote, the aliens, or I'm going to stick to Indians wherever I go. So that is a very constrictive idea of nationalism. It's good, it's not bad. But again, we need to go beyond that, like Tagore has mentioned, and then transcend it to the infinite. So we go out and mix with other people. So I'm just giving a very too simple an example, but it will make the concept much clearer. And it is basically here, as it mentioned in this essay, when you see the parts and you reject the whole, then you have one part of reality. You don't have the whole. But when you attempt to see the whole and you also see the part, then you have a realistic, a holistic understanding of the truth. Another essay, The Night, I'll quote from there. When we stay awake, there is a sport between our power and the power. So the power with capital power is the Supreme Being's power. We talked about Ladini Shakti, where the creator or the Supreme Being is happy creating for us, and we are also sharing the bliss. So the power and the power of the Supreme Being. There is a union of our action with the universal action of Vishwakarma. So it's inherently linked. So we being the finite and the supreme divine person, you can call it nature, you can call it person, you can give it names, but it's the same thing. It's like we are finite, but we are not limited because we have a link with the infinite through our actions. There is a concept, I mean, the time is too short, but there is a concept of karma yoga where you do something without expecting a return, without expecting the fruits of your labor. So that is also a kind of transcending from your limited actions to a divine action. This brings us to the concept of Vijnana. Contrary to what many might believe, Vijnana is not science here. Vijnana is beyond Jnana. It's a concept which Sri Ramakrishna spoke about, and this concept is rooted in the Upanishads, in the Bhagavad Gita. And these are some of the references in which this concept is in the Upanishads. I'm not bringing the Bhagavad Gita for time constraints. And it means immortality is attained through the absolute knowledge, that is Vijnana, of the immortal Brahman. You could superimpose Brahman with something greater good or knowledge or the omnipotent nature or whatever, the omnipotent spirit. Through the Atman, here the capital Atman is the Jnani which attains Brahma Jnana, and strength is obtained. How do you get the strength? The strength that you have the knowledge. you have it through the knowledge, the Vijnana, and you have the immortality from Vijnana, because Jnana, Sri Ramakrishna, in a very nice way, explains who a Jnani is. A Jnani is a person who enjoys the ocean of bliss by meditating and by saying neti neti, not this, not that. All right. And he believes the world around him to be, him or her, of course, to be false. Why? Because it's finite. So if it's a finite world, what am I doing? Doing presentations and having good food and enjoying life. I mean, it's just very brief. It's transitory. So what am I doing? The Vijnani is a person who goes beyond jnana, and the Vijnani realizes that all that I see around me is the Leela of the divine. So I want to take part in this divinity, in the sport of the divinity. So the Hladini Shakti, the sport of the divinity, and I want to redeem less mortal souls and guide them in a way. So the concept of Vijnana is you have the realization of the Jnani, but you also have the realization of the Bhakta, and where you understand that all around you is the mirth of God or Brahman or the Supreme Being. And that is how you function. So how do you do that? It is through love. So a Vijnani, out of immense compassion and love for ordinary beings who are not up to his level, for example, great spiritual persons like Sri Ramakrishna, he was a Vijnani. And Tagore, we do not know whether he had typical spiritual realizations, but yes, he was quite spiritual and philosophical in his own way. And his writings have depicted the concept of Vijnana in them. And I would end by reading from another Shantiniketan essay that I have translated. It's called The Prayer. And it goes like this. We find it, that is Amrita, where we have love. Amid this love itself, we get a taste of the infinite. It is love itself which puts the shadow of the infinite within the finite, transforms old into new, and never accepts death. When we observe the trace of love within diverse matters of the world, we get to know the Supreme Being who is beyond death. Through this, we understand that his true nature is the embodiment of love. So in these two texts that we have talked about, Ghore Baire, that is the home and the world, and Gora, we find that it is actually Tagore's philosophy of nationalism could be said to be love, because he does not believe in divisive forces. Rather, he believes in a universal oneness where he could embrace one and all. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such an interesting talk. I'm sure all of you have a lot of questions for ma'am or would like to interact with her. But please save your questions and comments for the Q&A session, which will be conducted at the end of session 1. Moving on to our next speaker, a poet, an editor, a translator, a researcher, a scholar. He is so much more. A truly passionate literary enthusiast, Dr. Kamlakar Bhatt is the head of the English department and professor at the Ahmednagar College. He has been a visiting faculty at the Department of English SPPU and has also been associated with the New Arts College, Yashwantrao Chavan Open University. Apart from being a distinguished professor, Dr. Bhatt is an eminent creative writer who has penned 5 anthologies of poetry in Kannada and has extensively translated poems from Kannada to English. His collection of poems, Churupuru Reshime, was the recipient of the Puttina Award in 2006. Furthermore, he has translated works by Chinua Achebe, Arun Kolatkar, D.H. Lawrence, and Franz Kafka, among several other interesting pieces of literature into Kannada. Dr. Kamlakar Bhatt has been a consistent researcher. Other than participating in numerous research projects, Dr. Bhatt has published many articles in national and international journals and has additionally authored a book by the name The Word in the World, Essays and Lectures of Professor H.S. Shivaprakash in 2019, and has also written several book chapters. Dr. Bhatt has guided and mentored several budding researchers and has presented over 30 papers in national and international conferences. He has also been a reviewer for the international academic journal Intersections of Australia and for Vidyapeeth, a journal of the Gujarat Vidyapeeth Ahmedabad. Furthermore, he has played a pivotal role in examining the theses of research scholars from various parts of India. He has also been invited by reputed colleges across Maharashtra to deliver his insights on various themes under literature, research, and pedagogy. Dr. Bhatt's achievements are endless, so let us enrich ourselves by listening to him. Sir, it gives us immense pleasure to invite you to begin your talk. Thank you. Sir, you're not audible, sir.
Thank you, Devika, for that
Yes.
very elaborate introduction.
Thank you, sir.
Good morning, everyone. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of this webinar, the Symbiosis College Pune, its principal, Dr. Soman, and Dr. Aarti Vani, the head of the Department of English, and my friend Anil Adagle, and all the members of the staff of the department. I also want to thank all of you who have joined this webinar. And thank you, Dr. Medha, for that excellent explication of Tagore's critique of nationalism and its literary representation in his novels. Dr. Medha and Dr. Aarti Vani have already thrown light on the contemporary approaches to the notion of nation. That nation is a modern form of identities of, ancient traditional communities. That nation is continuously being produced are some of the ideas that have been highlighted by them. I would like to focus on one of the means by which nation is forever produced and reproduced, as also imagined and reimagined. This narrativization of nation is best understood in the link between nation and narration, as has been pointed out by several scholars. Whether through novels or some other media, nation, or in fact any form of identity, is not only represented but also generated through narratives. To that extent, a range of texts, among them novel predominantly and prominently, represent an idea of a community, the ins and outs of that social group, the contours of its selfhood, both voluntarily and involuntarily. Such a configuration of community being a continuous project, such texts, visual, verbal, or any other media, constantly engage in marking and remarking the content, the boundaries, and the history of the identity of that social groups. This thought would not only alert us to the constitutive role of narratives, such as novels, but also to the larger idea that in their search for a voice, particular social groups create new languages, texts, and even the notions of the literary itself. My attempt in the course of this session is to elaborate on a small aspect of this line of thinking about nation and narratives. I would like to discuss how novel as a genre relates to nation and point towards the divergent processes present in novels that narrativize nation. Novel is one kind of narrative with which we word our worlds. Narratives do not just word our words, but also word our words. Our cognition of our own being in the world is enabled by the stories we gather up in our existence in this world. This worldliness enters into our structure of feeling and our structures of expressing. It is in this sense that our words are already a part of the world that we inhabit. I want to examine one of the ways in which the study of novels as a genre may be contextualized in the figure of nation. I aim to rework two very famous formulations on novel and nation. It has become necessary for anybody talking about literary discourses to take into account Benedict Anderson and Frederick Jameson while studying novels. As you can easily make out, we all three of us have referred to it already since morning. We can rework their thesis, that of Anderson and Jameson, by tracing certain commonality between nation and the novel as structures of organization, and view novel as a parasitic category, forming itself through forms other than itself. Just as nation as an identity category divorces and reconfigures pre-existing forms of collective identities. This generic similarity alerts us to the historical connections between the novel and nation and requires us to deploy this factor in our studies of novels. In connecting the novel with the exclusionary conditions of the production of national identity via the generic commonality between the novel and nation, we also begin to notice that novels position themselves in the conflictual side of the ideological battle between contesting nationalisms. Therefore, novels may be studied to discover the implicit construction and contestation of nation. That is the reason why I have titled this presentation, Staging the Nation, Construction and Contestation of Nation in Novels. Now, the tendency to study nation in its narrative address, as Homi Bhabha had phrased it, was, one can say, in a way initiated by Benedict Anderson, who contended that the birth of imagined community of the nation, and I'm reading this, can best be seen if we consider the basic structure of two forms of imagining which first flowered in Europe in the 18th century, the novel and the newspaper. For these forms provided the technical means for representing the kind of imagined community that is the nation. This is what Anderson says, and that is how he links nation, the imagination of nation, or the process of imagining nation with print with print media. So Anderson's book, Imagined Communities, has had far-reaching impact on two areas of scholarship, the nation and the novel. His insight that all communities larger than primordial villages of face-to-face contact, and perhaps even these, as he puts it, are imagined, has guided the debates on nation and nationalisms away from evaluations of good and bad types of nationalisms. The other insight illustrated in the passage that I just quoted is that print capitalism via newspapers and novel made it possible for people to experience the simultaneity of co-presence, which is what Dr. Aarti Vani was explaining in her opening remarks. Invoking Anderson, Timothy Brennan, in his book, Salman Rushdie and the Third World, argues, and let me quote, "It was the novel that historically accompanied the rise of nations by objectifying the one yet many of national life and by mimicking the structure of the nation, a clearly bordered jumble of languages and styles." Now, Brennan is suggesting here that the various types of speech and discourse that the novel incorporates indicate an imagined collectivity that is more than an individual can know. The suggestion implicit in both Anderson and Brennan is that novel has an inherent quality, its temporality, its bordered structure, its composite prose, etc., that makes it suitable medium for narrativizing the experience of nationalism. In a reductive summation, it may be stated that the historical emergence of the novel is linked to the historical emergence of nationalism and vice versa. Franco Moretti, in his book Atlas of the European Novel, he says, and I quote, "The novel functions as the symbolic form of nation state. It's a form that, unlike an anthem or a monument, not only does not conceal the nation's internal differences," and this is very important for my argument in this paper. A novel doesn't conceal the internal differences. An anthem or a monument or an architecture which also might do what novel does, that of imagining and configuring a nation. They tend to kind of hide the fact that there are always several ideas of nations, several notions of nations within a nation, and that there are lots of differences between these notions of nations, which is nothing but different notions of the community that lives together, as it were. So, novels do not do that. Novels do not really conceal the nation's internal differences, but manages to turn them into a story. Readers needed a symbolic form capable of making sense of the nation state. Well, I'm still reading Franco Moretti here. Well, the nation state found the novel, and vice versa, the novel found the nation state. And being the only form that could represent it, it became an essential component of our modern culture. I think I quite agree with the point Franco Moretti is making here in identifying common properties between novel and nation as structures of organization. I wish to suggest that without implying historical causality, the link between the two can be usefully explored, because the suggestion that somehow novel gives rise to nation was hotly contested and debated by several commentators. But I want to suggest that that's not the only way we can connect novel and nation. We can also look at novel and nation, both novel and nation, as structures of organization, which have very similar, properties as such. Bakhtin suggests that novel is a dialogistic form which uses many forms of discourse without anyone dominating. So the novel as a genre, according to Bakhtin, borrows from other genres and is not an independent, autonomous form. It's not, novel is not in itself a complete and autonomous kind of a genre. It is made up of other genres, is the point that he makes. Its being, as it were, is constituted by elements from compositional forms surrounding it. When I say compositional, I mean prose compositional forms surrounding it, predating it, not only prose, but even other kinds of compositions, discursive compositions, surrounding it, predating it, contemporary it, etc. This is something that even the historians of the novel have pointed out. Now, to take an example, Salman Rushdie's, think of Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children. I'll take the first sentence. Okay, I was born in the city of Bombay once upon a time, something like this. The first line is. So in this sentence, notably, two narrative registers are yoked together. The first part of the sentence, I was born in the city of Bombay. It invokes the style of the realist autobiographical fiction. While the second part, once upon a time, how it ends with, invokes the style of the traditional fable. So, similarly, the use of novel formed by Rajarao in his Kantapura provides another evidence for the malleability of the form. While the initial sections of Kantapura mimic the prose style of a traditional tale told by, the family elders or village elders, the later sections are more chronological, more organized, like in discursive prose. So this malleability seems to cling to the novel wherever it is deployed. Therefore, while it may be possible to specify the generic features of some of the other literary forms with less equivocation, in the case of the novel, we often specify features that always remind us of other literary forms. Thus, the novel forms itself through forms other than itself. We also notice that rather than a differential relation, the novel largely establishes a similitudinal relation with other generic forms. What is significant here is that the novel's form is not definitive or singular. It doesn't simply mean its opposite, that it has plural forms. What it also means is that even those plural forms of the novel are all in a similitudinal relation with a number of other generic forms, which are reconfigured, deployed with a difference within the novel to constitute the novelty of this form. The generic condition of nation appears to be similar. Nation, and that is one of the reasons why we find it very difficult, a lot of people find it very difficult to spot the novelty of nation, how nation has is a historically specific form of, organizing ourselves, organizing social groups. We find it difficult to see that because nation as an identity category is something that novel also is not an autonomous one. Like the novel, nation too is a space where a variety of other categories of collectivities are deployed. You look at the way nation is defined by anybody in any country. There is always some primordial, notion of identity, some primordial or pre-existing notion of collectivity or sociality that is necessarily involved. So nation, although it's a modern category of collective identity, it tends to, make use of all the pre-existing or at least several of the pre-existing categories of identity, thus giving also the impression of its, antiquity. Modernity introduced a number of challenges to the individual and collective identities. Modernization through capitalism, industrialization, division of labor, etc., rendered the traditional community identities inadequate. A new form of collective identification became necessary in view of the changes in the political, social, economic, geographical, and cultural terrains. Nation offers just such a category. But as a form of identity, it is not completely new at all. It attaches itself, as I said several times, to the traditional categories, works through them, subsuming them. In doing so, traditional categories are re-articulated, supplemented, complemented, restructured. Through this process, nation becomes a field of structuring the established identity concepts, inscribing modernity into them, so to say. So nation is a modern identity category. I'm, kind of emphasizing that, repeating that is at once a breaking away from, as well as a re-articulation of the pre-modern identity categories, and that is the reason why it very often seems to be continuous. Seems to be primordial, seems to be something that has existed forever. As Principal Dr. Soman earlier said, it gives us the impression that we have always been living in this nation, this notion of the thousands of years of history of nation. That impression is primarily because nation as an identity category kind of subsumes and therefore the cultural memories of the people There is no rupture. There is a certain kind of seamless continuity. So it's a breaking away from traditional identity categories insofar as it is an integration of such terrain of human activities as political, cultural, economic, temporal, and spatial. Unlike the earlier categories that are predominantly cultural, nation as an identity category is also political and economic. Along with the pre-modern categories, nation too has temporal and spatial congruities as its basis of group formation. We kind of the fact that we kind of throw our memory back to thousands of years and see ourselves as a single community, single seamless continuous community, and we see ourselves as one across a diverse geographical space. That itself suggests how, but what has to be also remembered that this congruity doesn't exist by itself. That congruity is produced, and in the production of this congruity, in the gluing together of this temporal and spatial congruity, media like novel, narrativization through media like novel, or as Benedict Anderson said, newspapers, and many other forms, of course, matter a lot. So nation is an empty field, variously fused in contingent cases by different marks of identity to varying degrees and in a variety of combinations. That is why, depending on where you are, you emphasize a different aspect of your quote unquote nationness. If suppose imagine somebody in a foreign country, quote unquote foreign country. Suppose one is in North America, then one may kind of emphasize India as one's identity. But if one is already in India, say for example in Mumbai, one may emphasize not India but Maharashtra, and therein this region of Maharashtra or this district of Maharashtra, within that this taluka of, so on and so forth. And it comes right down to various smaller identity. So in that sense, nation is never a single identity. It is something that kind of brings together in a variety of combination in varying degrees different marks of identity. So for example, a group of people may see themselves as a linguistically united nation with a degree of ethnic, racial, and religious marks characterizing each member of the group. The order of these infusions and the inclusiveness or exclusiveness of these marks coalesced may be seldom consistent. It is rather a fluid area, always left vague. That it is left vague hints at the malleability of the category, the internal form of which is articulated contingently, depending on the context. It is articulated differently, ever so slightly differently. This has to do with the identity, with the fact that identity is set in relation, what identity is set in relation to. In other words, it is the differential identity that decides the internal form of the otherwise fluid category of nation. Thus, an identity based on nation is not the same as class or clan or race or region or religion or linguistic identity, though each of these inflect inform, and reconfigure national identity. So nation, like the novel, is a parasitic genre constituting itself as other than the forms through which it forms itself. I mean, continuously, it is, if you focus on one aspect, other aspects become, and that is the reason why, I'm talking about nation as something that is continuously staged. There is that element of drama in it. There's that element of performativity in it. You have to produce it. Like you produce a drama, no? You have to produce it and you have to stage it, so to say. And it is continuously done. So both the nation and the novel are sites where multiple conditions of being are staged. The condition of possibility of such a staging seems to pertain to the substitutive roles they play in relation to the forms they devote in presenting themselves. Since the arrival of the nation category, all the categories of collectivities are infected by it. Nation has come to be used as a preferred synonym for various group identities. And sometimes it's used as as if it is an equivalent word for many other kind of community identities. So similarly, novelizing of other literary genres, including poetry, we can see that poetry has become novelized over the years, especially in the last 100 or so years. Something that Bakhtin pointed out in early 20th century. So in constructing the analogous link between the nation and the novel through their generic conditions, a useful advantage is obtained for a political reading of novels. One of the questions posed to this link is, do all the novels narrate the nation? Here, of course, one is looking at the contents, so to say, of the novel. This is something that perhaps reminds you of the debate that Frederick Jameson's comment had initiated, and it was Aizaz Ahmad who had responded to that, and then many other scholars joined this. But this debate, kind of focuses much more on the contents aspects of it, the space of community represented in the novel. When the novel is seen thus as ventriloquizing for the people who imagine the community, it imposes a limit on the analogy. If one considers the limited issue of how a novel represents nationhood, many novels will have to, be kept out of this discussion. The burden of this mode of linking the novel and nation is that it seems to work chiefly with the realist novels. However, it is perhaps useful to understand the nation novel link in terms of the generic conditions they shape, which is what I was trying to elaborate so far. Such an approach does not necessitate a strict equivalence between the narrated content of a novel and the particular nation it is supposed to refer to. Nor does it require that the novel be of a realist type for us to explore its link with nation. The point is not that the novel is a primary condition for imagining the nation, but that it does suggest how, under the impact of the discursive practices constituting and engendered by modernity, both brought into being by modernity as well as producing modernity, new modes of imagining and representing the collectivity are simultaneously generated, and that is what this link can throw light on. These new modes, such as print media, novel, etc., engage in a negotiation that is neither too comfortable with nor entirely defiant of the pre-existing modes. It's an engagement that sets up new temporal and spatial practices, resulting in heterogeneous time and heterotopias. The commonality of the generic conditions of the nation and the novel alerts a literary student to view nation as a chronotope of the novel. The relation between nation and novel. Frederick Jameson famously stated, and I uh, quote, all third world texts are necessarily, I want to argue, allegorical, dominantly Jameson had made. And this proposition, of course, was mentioned on several grounds, including on the implicit privileging of the binary opposition between the first and the third world. An obvious question for Jameson's not. Whether or not a progressive cultural practice depends upon the political character of the power block which takes hold of it and utilizes it as a material force in the process of constituting its own hegemony. And that is the kind of argument that Aizaz Ahmad made. So it would be easy, though limiting, to view a novel as representing a nation through a sociological journey across its space. The question regarding the imagination of collectivity that comes to be represented in a novel can be raised outside the allegorical framework also. The reading offered by Anderson of Filipino writer Rizal's work has been turned into a modular framework. It is in that framework that even Jameson is talking about. It is even more challenging to go beyond unraveling the nationalistic content of what are called as foundational fictions. The construction of nation in a novel is a complex issue and would involve more than mimetic representation. If viewed as figuration of the reality of the nation in a literary form, the mode of representation implicitly valorized is that of mimetic. I think that the important part of Jameson's thesis is, particularly when their forms develop out of predominantly Western machineries of representation, such as the novel, when he says that, the link between novel as the medium of cultural production and nation as its material condition for representation has an interesting edge to it. We need to emphasize that edge by specifically noting the historical co-evalness of the two, simultaneity of the two. I think attending to the commonality of the generic conditions of the novel and the nation enables us to view how novel becomes a complex and conflictual site of figuration, configuration, and reconfiguration of the discursive traces for mobilizing the nation imaginary. my argument so far has been to suggest that in the way nation and the novel operate as structures of organization, there are similarities which are historically conditioned. This link has a bearing on literary studies, making it necessary for novel criticism to attend to this historical twinning. Therefore, the thesis propounded by Anderson and Jameson, widely debated, elaborated, and contested, continue to be pertinent and require to be reworked again and again. Discussions about nations and nationalisms very often raise issues related to hegemonic conditions inherent therein. Nation is a narrative continuously produced by nationalism. Irrespective of its state, nation is always plural. That is, there are different conceptions of collective identity that come to inform or even make a claim the practices that generate nationalisms. Hence, at any point in time, nation as a category of collective identity is a contested one. These contestations reveal the various, and it is in this sense that one of the early theorists of nation had said that nation is a daily plebiscite. So these contestations reveal the various forms of exclusions in the production of the hegemonic conception of nation. The whole idea here is, what is the hegemonic form of nation, and what are the contestatory forms of nation? What are the alternative conceptions of nations that exist? So the exclusions, whether of women, lower classes, castes, ethnic groups, linguistic groups, are part of the politics of nationalism that claims to speak for all and to include all, while marginalizing and silencing some. Isn't it? So I wish to briefly trace a line of argument connecting the novel with the exclusionary conditions of the production of national identity via the generic commonality between novel and nation. Novels participate in the ideological productions of national identities and hence even in the contestatory structure. That is to say, novels position themselves in the conflictual site of the ideological battle between contesting nationalisms. Narration of nation is an attempt at privileging a particular configuration of nation. Novels might either, facilitate such a hegemonic configuration of nation, or novels might even reveal. In fact, it is possible to follow Pierre Macheret's formulation, insert that into this thinking and suggest that it is possible to look at, and it is in this sense we can also make use of Jameson's notion of national allegory in a creative manner, in the sense that we can read between the lines to see not only the hegemonic configuration of nation, but also the contestatory forms that are just below the surface, so to say. And I remember having done that kind of a reading of Kantapura some time back. Anyway, novels may be studied to discover the implicit construction and contestation of nation. If seen from the point of view of hegemonic construction of nation, we notice that the novel, considered in its total condition as a written literature, has an inbuilt elitist mechanism. I mean to say that novel as a genre is necessarily, has that built-in, condition of exclusions. Therefore, the articulation of contestation of the hegemonic structures is also an internal contestation of the very genre. We can't forget that. You see, that is to say, we notice that novels that take radical political position in terms of the construction of collective identity tend to also render the form of the novel complex. So one of the significant features of the novel as a genre is its relation to writing. We have come to appreciate this from Bhaktin, who says, and I quote this, "Only novel is younger than writing and book. It alone is organically receptive to new forms of mute perceptions, that is reading." All other literary forms, lyric, epic, ballad, drama, and any other form of narratives in print media were all pre-existing. Novel was born after book had come into being, so to say. So as a literary phenomenon, the novel is situated in the complex of production, circulation, and consumption. The novel is then, as in fact literature also, an institutional practice which exists in this triad of production, circulation, and consumption. The processes of production, circulation, and consumption introduce a principle of exclusivity, making novel that much less accessible. This limit on the dissemination underwrites the novel's elitism. Therefore, even as we study the thematic of ethical sociality in novels, the kind of restrictive determination exercised by its institutional location has to be factored in, which becomes, how novel is a kind of an elitist form when we take into account the production, circulation, and consumption of books, becomes clear when we think of the social media that we are using today, which has really, in one sense, has undone that elitism, because it has enabled anybody to be able to communicate their narratives, and it is in this context that the million mutinies that V.S. Naipaul was referring to is realized in this in the digital world that we are all using now. I think with that, I would like to suggest that it is high time we theorized, or rather we re-theorized, novel, because in present conditions, novel perhaps is already undergoing drastic transformation. So we need to re-theorize the generic understanding of novel for today's times, and that is the kind of work that is ahead of us, is what I would like to end this presentation with. Thank you very much, all of you, for listening to me, and thank you, Symbiosis, Department of English, and all my friends there for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insightful talk. I would now like to invite Dr. Subarna Bhattacharya to take over the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Devika. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, you are.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so what to say? It was an enriching experience, indeed a very profitable one, to listen to Dr. Medha Bhattacharya and Professor Kamlakar Bhatt. I'm sure our participants here have many questions in mind, and I can see, yeah, so the chat box is enabled and we are eagerly waiting for the question answer session. So I request you all to type your questions and please mention also to whom it is directed so that our speakers can answer your questions. So as we wait, maybe I can have my questions asked. Medha, Dr. Medha Bhattacharya. So you have been talking about the Upanishad and you know how Tagore read Upanishad and was influenced. How would you think that Tagore's interest and valuing of the Upanishad, that given he was definitely critiquing militant nationalism and was talking about internationalism, right? So, do you think that Tagore was inspired, influenced by some aspects of Upanishad in that also? Have you come across anything in particular?
Thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya, for that interesting question. Well, I think in all Tagore's writing, we find the influence of the Upanishad. And this text is no different. And whenever he spoke of nationalism, in fact, he also had his reservations about the Satyagraha, and he did not believe in any kind of restrictive attitude towards any movement in a way. So I think he was deeply influenced by the Upanishads because in Chandogya Upanishad, there is a shloka which when translated means when you constrict yourself, you are, when you expand, you become happy. When you constrict yourself, then you do not become happy. So in a way, when you are restricting yourself, you are also shutting off the other possibilities. And he was not interested in doing that. In fact, he was more into opening up towards the global audience. If you see his poems also, he has the same trend coming in. So, and there were many instances in his book Nationalism, in several essays. He was very much against any kind of coercive forces to do anything at all. In fact, even in the Shantiniketan essays, there is an essay called Aro, that means more. And he's in a way criticizing how war takes away people by force. And just because you are with a particular country or you belong to a particular country, when the war begins, you just have to go and serve your country. And in the process, so many mothers are childless, so many kids are being orphaned, and so many wives are losing their husbands. So see, he's very critical about this whole issue. So I think the Upanishads have shaped his thought process.
Right. Yes. We have a couple of questions that I can see in the chat box. All are to you, Dr. Medha. So one question is, in Gora, can it be said that Paresh Babu comes closest to Tagore's ideas of the finite and the infinite? And even then, isn't he limited by his sympathetic affiliations towards the British in the novel? So, who embodies Tagore's views of holistic humanism then?
Yes, I think, thank you for that question, Shruti. I think, yes, you're right to an extent that among everyone in the novel, Paresh Babu is projected as the guru figure, and Gora actually returns to him, and he takes Shuchorita, he takes the help of Shuchorita to reach him. So Paresh Babu has been, projected as a guru figure. So in a way, you could say that, yes, Tagore's own ideas are reflected to a certain extent on Paresh Babu's approach to the whole situation. Thank you. And does that answer your question, Shruti?
I guess.
And there is Srija who also asked.
So there's another question. What is the role of leftist movement as talked in Gora and Ghare Baire? Bimala's attraction of Sandeep was not love, and Nikhilesh's view of Bimala was like that of a project he has taken as a benevolent zamindar. So,
okay, so there is a quotation.
Yeah, and don't you think that this is, in a way, a marginalization of women in a roundabout way, and not a manifestation of love and freedom? We are going very textual.
Okay, yeah, contextual, which is very interesting. Thank you for that question, Srija. I know there are parts to the question. I don't know whether I'll be able to address them properly, but I'll do my best. Regarding your leftist movement in Gora and Ghare Baire, I'll take that. Yeah, I think that you have also numbered them very carefully. So I won't really categorize. If I see Tagore's philosophy, you know that Tagore also had a Sriniketan project, but he would not want me to categorize him as a leftist or a rightist. And he would like to stay free from any of these isms or any of these political points of views, but he definitely has sympathy for the underprivileged people, or rather, if you use the leftist terminology, the have-nots. And that is why he's making Nikhil in Ghare Baire sympathize, and Gora as well, sympathizing with their situation, or in a way empathizing with the situation and doing whatever they can. And in a way, the characters are empathizing, but also Tagore himself being very critical of the way the Swadeshi movement was at that time. He was very critical of it. And it is, many people criticize him. They don't understand the logic behind why he did that. But one of those things where his approach towards the underprivileged. And let me see, the second question is Bimala's attraction. It is not love, maybe it is lust, if you can put it. But again, I would say it depends on whose perspective you're seeing it from. Like when I talked about Sandeep, he has more of self-love, and I think there was a kind of love which was maybe a finite kind of love, limited. It was from Bimala to Sandeep. And then when Bimala finds out the kind of person Sandeep is from different people, especially the young person working for the freedom movement, he finds out how Sandeep is as a person. And through that, and through the other way in which Sandeep conducts himself, she withdraws from that relationship and returns to the inner world, to the home where her husband is. And I think it is, I would say it's a bit strong if you say that Nikhil was being the benevolent zamidar, but I think during that time in which we are talking about, bringing your own wife, an aristocratic family, a zamidar, bringing your own wife to the forefront itself required, and then the relationship that develops between his friend and his wife, that he knew, but he did not stop it. He let it continue until Bimola herself realized what she was doing and then steps back. So in a way, I wouldn't like to say it was a benevolent zamidar giving some kind of liberty or maybe some kind of lease, but I would definitely say that was a different era. And so the idea that he took his wife outside and let her decide what she wanted to do, and without curbing her independence, I think that goes a long way. I don't know whether you're satisfied with this, but if it were today and the whole situation happened today, I would have definitely raised questions about it just the way you have. But when it is around that time of the century, I think most men wouldn't want to do that. The societal structure was very restrictive. But thank you for these thought-provoking questions.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Medha Bhattacharya.
I think there are other questions too.
If I was thinking if we could direct some questions to Professor Amalakar Bhatt here. So I can see a question from one of our third year students, sir. So Bitika asks that how does the construction of the idea of a nation in a novel influence or impact the reception of the novel amongst audience? Readers, I think she means.
Yeah, thank you, Bitika, for that question. How does the construction of the idea of a nation in a novel influence or impact the reception of the novel among audiences? I think, it is talking about the reception of the novel becomes important for two reasons. Number one, as you have asked, how the novel influences the audience. That is one aspect of it. But there's also this other aspect where what kind of novels receive, an audience, and what kind of novels are celebrated, and what kind of novels receive a certain kind of projection in a society, etc. This is not a one-way kind of a procedure. It is forever. I think it is moving in multiple directions, and therefore I was talking about this triad of production, circulation, and consumption. And if we try to research that in as many details as possible, we might find very interesting directions. We can't really predict these directions, but some of these may relate to not only how audience is shaped, and in the sense in which the writer becomes a kind of an avant-garde, but also how what kind of novels come to be written because keeping a certain kind of a audience in mind. If you look at the kind of novel, the kind of popularity which goes up and down, the waves of popularity of different genres, we see a very interesting situation there, where, for example, the mythologicals suddenly begin to become very prominent in the early 21st century. Why are these mythological fiction has acquired such a prominence, and how more and more, novels are taking that direction? That perhaps is a very interesting question to ask as well. So to give a more clear answer to less, an unequivocal answer to your question, I think that the manner in which construction of nation takes place in novels does impact the audience in the sense that it has it contributes, and this has been noted largely, how novels have contributed to the nationalist helps in mobilizing national sentiments. But I think I would be interested in also examining the other direction more carefully, because that, I think, has received much less attention.
Right. Thank you, Professor Bhatt. I think some of the questions can be clubbed together because many of them relate to the translation scenario that, when there is a translation. For instance, Dr. Shweta Kapoor asked that as a translation, how challenging do you think? Because we know about your translation work and how, as a translator, you are always working and giving us this. So how challenging do you think is it to keep the identity that builds up in a novel's narration intact when it comes to translation? On the same line, there is another question by Srija that how to anticipate the reader's community in a translation scenario in India.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for taking this discussion towards translation. I think that's also an important element which hasn't entered into the discussion so far. As all of us understand, translation is a kind of reading, isn't it? So it's not only translation that might inflect the novel in a particular direction, or what you have said, distorts to some extent. Any reading would, every reader, whether that reader is an academic, a reviewer, a student writing an answer in an exam, or a translator, because translator ultimately is one such reader, perhaps would not only internalize the let us say identity categories that are projected in a novel, to put it that way, or the representation of nation in a novel, but every reader also contests it implicitly, in the sense that we don't only read lines, we also read in between lines. I think we do continuously engage in stated or unstated contestations of the kind of construction that takes place in novels. We may articulate it or not articulate it, and this happens even in novels, and many translators have pointed this out. A translation may, for example, mute a particular, let's say, mute a particular kind of identity, or it might deliberately, I know a translator who deliberately avoided the kind of, let us say, the kind of misogynistic narrations or descriptions that were there in a novel. So these are this kind of a politics of reading is bound to be there, and that is that applies even to translation. I think that answers. I don't know whether that answers the second question. I can't see that here. I can't find that here right now.
Yeah, so the second question was that how challenging is it to anticipate the reader's community in a translation scenario?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that was
Thank you for that question. How challenging? Well, it is very challenging in our country. In our country, it's very challenging, especially in our country. I would say, perhaps that's something that everyone would say, especially because you see, even when one is translating, let's say one is translating into Marathi. Let us take the situation of translation into Marathi or translation into Hindi. Whatever the case may be, how does one, what language does one translate into? This becomes a very important question, and there itself, there is a certain kind of a projection of community. There's a certain identity that is being projected. What Marathi or what Hindi has one translated into? So the choice of words, the choice of phrases, the choice of idioms, the choice of the syntax, all these also are levels at which representation of nation, representation of identities do take place, and it is never possible to have a perfect translation in that sense, isn't it? Because you can't be addressing everyone at the same time, and among the challenges that a translator faces, one of them is to resolve this as to what language does one translate into, because there are so many sociolects in our languages, Marathi or Hindi. There's so many, and therefore translating it into one standard language is a problem, which all of us have come to realize now. But then if we do not translate, if we translate into a standard language, then also we are addressing a certain audience. And if we translate into a particular sociolect, then also we are addressing a particular audience. So this is an issue that requires us to be very clear about our political position vis-a-vis the text that we are translating. I think there are many factors related to the text and the context of the writing of that text, and what the content of that text, etc., that should also be taken into account while deciding the language. That perhaps is my tentative answer to that question.
Right, yes, and definitely if that is the case, then the imagination or the construction of nation in a narrative gets problematized there. Right. Yeah, there is another question to you, Professor Bhatt, that Sri Lakshmi asks that do you feel that novels can bring significant changes in the society in terms of caste and subcaste restrictions? Because usually India is popular as a democratic secular country, but do we know, we do know the inner workings of the government is still corrupted, and we have a lot of restrictions on us based on our caste. So can novels or any other literary form, for that matter, reform these baseless restrictions in our nation ever?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Sri Lakshmi, for that question. I don't know whether novels can solve our social problems. That is number one. But I can point out that novels have been used, not only novels, other kinds of writings also. For example, look at the use of autobiography in Maharashtra, whether we are looking at Dalit autobiographies or women's autobiographies, or autobiographies for other communities. The media such as this, whether autobiographies, novels, or songs of uh, activists, the activist songs, like for example the shires in Maharashtra in various social movements, the kind of songs that are very often used by activists, etc. If we study that, we notice that yes, there is something they may or may not have actually contributed to changing material conditions, but they have they have definitely helped the communities in finding certain channels for articulating themselves, number one. Number two, mobilizing themselves. And number three, also to communicate their sense of their world, their, and find newer, modes of, their community identities. And I think it is in this respect that textuality or representative mechanisms do help, novel being one such. In
Right.
other words, to give a much more direct answer, it may not have a, it may not directly, like in the case of activism, it may not directly contribute to changing the society and bring about equality and casteless society, etc. But it does act as a tool that helps in in the process of social transformation.
Right. Sir, I have a question for you. So I'll go ahead with my questions and then take
Please,
a few more. Yeah. So novel has formal overlaps with other forms also, right? When there is because we are in a time of experimentation with the form itself. So when it comes to imagining, constructing nation, as you were saying, as through an organized imagination of an organized structure. So does formal experimentation impact any way? If you could tell us something more.
I think it does. I think it is an area that is underexplored so far. But if we look at novels, not only novels, even other kinds of writing, overall, if you look at the way in which a genre is deployed and the manner in which genres are deployed, we do notice how significant the generic or the formal aspects are in this context of representation of identity, whether it is nation or other kinds of identities. Whether it is, for example, other community identities, like in the case of women's gender-based or sexuality-based identities, or other, community-based identities, etc. So my point is this, that this that kind of an examination, I'll give you one or two simple examples. For example, um, uh, Professor Aniket Zavre had a very interesting discussion of Manju Ghosh, if I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it correctly, that text, and how the opening sentence consisting of two registers, alerts us to the manner in which novel is in a way, nativized or Indianized, as it were. So that itself alerts us to the fact that although, for example, novel is a European form, as it were, but the manner in which novel is practiced in India, or, it is not only a derivation, there is also a deviation that's involved. And a similar kind of a discussion we can have with respect to, many texts, and let me give you, because it immediately comes to my mind, Raja Rao's Kantapura, for example. If you look at the initial sections of Kantapura, you will notice the prose style of Kantapura, which is even pointed out by Raja Rao in his preface. It has this interminable sentence, but that interminable sentence is restricted only to a certain section of the novel. After a point, after the so-called nation, imagination has already entered into this village, the events that happen after that are narrated in a completely different kind of a prose style. You don't have that interminable sentence any longer. You don't have that, loopy structure any longer. There's a much more logical prose following afterwards. So if we attend to the formal features, whether it is syntax, whether it is, the linguistic features and other features, I was giving you the example of, Salman Rushdie, right? And we do notice that many of these are articulated even at the level of form, and not only at the level of content. And I think the interesting question is, what are the continuities and discontinuities between the formal, the direction in which form is going and the direction in which the content is going? Is there conflicts there? Are there is there discontent there, etc.? I think that also would be an interesting area of examination.
Right. Thank you so much, sir. So I think I'll take a question for Medha. Rutuja asked long back actually. Medha, are you here? Dr. Medha Bhattacharya? Yeah, so there was a question for you. Don't you think that Tagore's idea of nationalism was somewhere characterized by ambivalence in Home and the World? So to worship my country as a god is to bring curse upon it. And
I tried to answer that question, very briefly in the chat. Thank you for that question. And I believe that here, Tagore is, when he says, I don't want to, it's like looking down upon my country if I worship it like a god. I think that question of his aversion towards the kind of nationalism practice is again coming into forefront, because when you say I like worshiping the country as God, there is a kind of projection there. And he's trying to avoid all sorts of projection. And when she talks about, when you're talking about the national anthem, Sri Lankan national anthem was not written by Tagore, but inspired by the Indian national anthem. So inspired by Tagore's writing the Bangladeshi and Indian national anthem. But if you see the lyrics of Jana Gana Mana, and if you go through the entire, because we just sing one of it. If you go through the other stanzas of that huge poem that Tagore composed, it really gives you a kind of awakening. Like Dr. Bhatt was talking. Someone asked Dr. Bhatt a question about whether literature or novel has any direct impact on society, and Dr. Bhatt said, not just novels, but other pieces of literature, other genres of literature. Definitely, the national. If you see the national anthem, and especially when you hear it, you can go to YouTube and hear it. You would feel that awakening when you hear all the stanzas together. So if you see the lyric, it's a very different kind of lyric. Like I mentioned, there is a spiritual awakening, and by spiritual, I don't mean fanaticism. Whatever spiritual means, like my relationship with the divine, and you have that awakening within you. So that kind of literature or that kind of writing had the power to awaken those feelings in you. some kind of powerful feelings where you really want to do something, and it forces you to kind of act in a particular way. You feel that you belong to this whole universe. It's not, of course, he's mentioning geographical places, but again, the idea is it really goes beyond geography, and you feel so proud of it. So I think in that way, it's not really very contradictory, because he's against any kind of stereotypical idea of the motherland. So I guess that is how I would categorize it as. I don't know whether it answers her question. And I think there's another question. She talks about, yeah, there is another question in the chat box about Shuchorita's part in Gora and why she follows orthodoxy. Okay, I would
I think there have been many questions. So because we are running behind time, I think we will have to screen the questions also. So maybe the questions, maybe Medha, if you would want to share your email in the chat box. So if there are more questions, maybe you can ask Dr. Medha Bhattacharya. You can forward your questions to her. I'm sure she will be happy to answer.
Absolutely.
I saw one question for Professor Bhatt. Professor Bhatt, are you here?
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the last question that we are taking, and we have to break for lunch. So the last question for today, my question to Professor Bhatt, Ranjit Mote asks, is that you talked about Bakhtin and the dialogic nature of novels. So can novels be monologic? And if yes, can they form a nationalist narrative that's rigid, monolith, authoritarian? If such novels are in the forefront or mainstream, what sort of national identity we are talking about in such a scenario?
Well, thank you, Ranjit. It's a difficult question, I must say, to answer, because I can't readily think of examples to illustrate or exemplify my answer. But I feel that we can't answer in black and white to this question. To the first part of the question, where you ask whether there are whether novels can be monologic. I think what Bakhtin is pointing out is that in novels there are both centrifugal and centripetal tendencies. So there is monologic tendency in a way, as well as dialogic tendencies. There might be a novel in which dialogic tendency is greater and monologic tendency is less, or vice versa, etc. So it might be a matter of degree. These tendencies may not be black and white. This novel is monologic, that novel is dialogic, etc. Rather than that, it might be the case that in novels there might be both these tendencies. In as far as whether a narrative can have a monolithic notion of nation, yes, it is possible. When novels, we usually call such novels propagandist novels. The propagandist novels of any hue can tend to be can tend to represent in a in black and white, as it were, in a rigid form of identity may be represented. But Another question that you have asked, what sort of national identity we're talking about when we have such a scenario? Yeah, that would be a monolithic identity that we are talking about. It is not necessarily, this or that. There can be a novel by somebody belonging to, oppressed class, which is monolithic, or there can be a novel by somebody which represents the nation in a very hegemonic colors, that can be a monolith. So this is something that depends on that novel. But my answer to the question is yes, it is possible for a novel to present, a kind of a rigid, singular community identity. But usually such novels do not catch our attention as much as novels that create space for diverse social experiences. And that is the reason why we talk about the dialogic nature of novel, because it tends to create space for diverse experiences. And novels that do that also tend to keep this notion of identity also open, perhaps.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Kamalakar Bhatt and Dr. Medha Bhattacharya, for so patiently answering all questions. Due to lack of time, we have not been able to take all the questions that were there in the chat box. But thank you so much for being here, for joining here today, and for explaining in such elaborate way all the aspects that we discussed today. It was really enriching and profitable for all of us, I am sure. So we are breaking for lunch now. We will resume in 45 minutes for session 2 to begin. So it is 1:45 now. I will be expecting all our participants to be back at 1:30 for session 2, where we have another 2 brilliant speakers who will be joining us, Dr. Professor D.R. Purohit and Professor Raj Rao for their talk. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Aarti ma'am, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I was just saying thank you so much, Dr. Bhattacharya and Dr. Kamalakar Bhatt, for being here and sharing your thoughts. Thank you so much.